You're carrying a name right now that someone, somewhere, decided was worth bleeding for, maybe dying for. The official story tells us that Scottish clans are about tartans, Highland games, and misty postcards. That's not the history. The history is a weapons chart disguised as a family tree. 12 surnames, 12 bloodlines, each one tied to a specific side in a specific fight, and some of them tied to a punishment that followed. We are going to start wide and end with the names that got hit hardest when the smoke cleared. Stay for number 1. That story ends in a prison tower. Number 12. Armstrong. The name comes from exactly where you think it does. A strong arm, a working description, not a poetic one. And that tells you something about how the Armstrongs saw themselves. Practical, physical, and completely uninterested in abstract loyalty to a distant throne. The Armstrongs weren't a Highland clan in the way most people picture. They lived in the border country, the contested strip of land between Scotland and England, where neither crown had reliable control, and where nation was a concept that mattered a lot less than next winter's food supply. The borders in the 15th and 16th centuries were a place where raiding wasn't criminality, it was agriculture by other means. You took cattle, grain, and goods from neighboring families because your family needed them. The Armstrongs were among the most effective at this. At their peak, the clan could reportedly put several thousand armed riders in the field, a force large enough to make both the Scottish and English crowns deeply uncomfortable. When you ask, who did the Armstrongs fight for, the honest answer is, themselves. That's not cynicism. That's the logic of a people living in a place where loyalty to an abstract king had never once kept them fed. The crown eventually ran out of patience. In 1530, King James V rode into the borders under the pretense of a hunting trip, invited the Armstrong chief to meet him, and had him hanged on the spot. No trial, no formal charge that stuck. Just a king deciding that a clan too powerful to control was better dealt with as a body count than a negotiation. The name survived. But that execution was the beginning of the end for Armstrong dominance on the border. What it tells you, if your name is Armstrong, is that your ancestors fought for something older and more honest than nationalism. They fought for survival, and when the state finally came for them, it didn't bother with the pretense of justice. From lawless borders to a clan so powerful it became the crown's worst nightmare for entirely different reasons. Number 11. Douglas. There's a phrase in Scottish history that gets used about this clan, Good Sir James, referring to Robert the Bruce's closest military commander, James Douglas. But the deeper story behind the Douglas name is less about chivalry and more about what happens when a clan accumulates enough land, enough soldiers, and enough political weight that the king stops sleeping soundly. The Black Douglases, the senior branch of the family, controlled territory across southern Scotland that functioned less like a noble estate and more like a parallel state. They had their own administrative structures, their own military networks, their own foreign relationships. When a clan can negotiate independently with England while simultaneously collecting taxes from Scottish tenants, the line between powerful ally and existential threat disappears fast. The Crown's answer came in 1452. King James II invited William Douglas, the 8th Earl, to Stirling Castle for dinner under a guarantee of safe conduct and personally stabbed him to death at the table. His body was thrown from a window. The official justification was treason. The actual justification was fear. That act of royal violence tells you more about how Douglas' power worked than any battle record. When a name frightens a sitting monarch enough to break his own guarantee of safe passage, that name wasn't just a family. It was a problem the state couldn't solve by conventional means. The Douglas story is about power that grew too visible and paid for it at a dinner table. The Campbell story is the opposite. It's about a clan that watched what happened to the Douglases and every clan like them and drew a very specific lesson. Number 10. Campbell. From the Gaelic Cambule, crooked mouth, Not a flattering origin, and the Campbells didn't build their power by worrying about flattery. Watch what they did instead. The Douglases accumulated land and soldiers and foreign relationships until they became too visible to ignore, and a king stabbed one of them at dinner. The Campbells watched that happen. They watched it happen to other clans too, the ones who confused raw power with durable power, and they drew a lesson that most Highland chiefs were too proud to learn. You don't beat the crown by rivaling it. You survive by making yourself useful to it. The Campbells aligned with the Scottish crown, then with the English Parliament, then with whoever offered the best political return on loyalty. Their territory in Argyll, the western seaboard of Scotland, was strategic and fertile, and they used every acre of it as a bargaining chip. Where other clans sent broadswords, the Campbells sent lawyers. Where other clans built armies, they built relationships inside the institutions that were replacing armies as the real levers of power. The result was a clan that appears in nearly every major conflict in Scottish history and somehow keeps surviving them. Flodden, the wars of independence, the Jacobite risings, always present, always on whichever side had the better long-term odds. The Glencoe massacre in 1692 sits at the darkest edge of that calculation. Campbell's soldiers killed 38 members of the MacDonald clan in the middle of the night, in the homes of people who'd sheltered them as guests, acting on government orders. That's not a battle. That's a service rendered to a patron at a cost paid entirely by someone else. If your name is Campbell, your bloodline comes from the most politically effective clan Scotland ever produced. Whether that reads as a compliment depends entirely on what you think survival cost them. Number 9. MacDonald. Here's what the official story quietly buries. Before Scotland consolidated as a kingdom, a separate sovereign power operated inside its borders. Not a clan, a state. The lordship of the Isles controlled the Hebrides and the western seaboard through its own court, its own laws, its own tax system, and its own diplomatic relationships with Ireland and England conducted without Edinburgh's knowledge or approval. The MacDonalds didn't petition the Scottish Crown for permission to conduct foreign policy. They simply conducted it because for 2 centuries they had the power to. The sea routes they controlled weren't fishing lanes. They were military highways. A MacDonald chief could move an army across open water faster than any mainland force could push through a Highland pass. That's not a tribal advantage. That's a strategic capability that rivaled anything the Crown could deploy against it. So in 1493, the Crown did what states do when negotiation fails. It dismantled the lordship by legal decree, stripped the MacDonalds of formal power, and deliberately fragmented the clan into competing branches too divided to reconstitute what they'd lost. MacDonald, MacDonald, each spelling carrying its own territorial memory of a Gaelic political order that Edinburgh had just decided to classify as folklore. The Glencoe massacre in 1692 targeted one of those branches specifically. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, killed in their beds by soldiers they'd sheltered as guests the night before. 38 dead. The survivors driven into a February snowstorm with nothing. That wasn't a military action. That was a message about what happens to people who remember too clearly what they used to be. Once something that size gets broken, the clans around it have a decision to make, fast. Number 8. Cameron. The Camerons of Lochaber didn't accumulate power through political maneuvering the way the Campbells did, or through maritime territory the way the MacDonalds did. Their reputation was built on one thing. They were extraordinarily difficult to defeat in the field, and everyone knew it. The British government's response to the Cameron clan after the Jacobite risings tells you more than any battle account. They built Fort William at the entrance to Cameron territory. A permanent stone military installation, garrisoned and supplied, designed specifically to prevent one clan from mobilizing its fighters. Think about what that actually means. The state looked at a surname and decided the answer was architecture. Donald Cameron of Lochiel, the clan chief in 1745, was the figure whose support gave Bonnie Prince Charlie's landing any real credibility. Without Lochiel's commitment, the rising likely collapses before it starts. The Cameron clan fought at Prestonpans, Falkirk, and Culloden. After the defeat, Lochiel escaped to France. British forces burned Cameron homes and took Cameron land. The fort stayed. If your name is Cameron, the British Army once considered your bloodline a military problem serious enough to require a permanent solution in stone. Number 7. Ross. The name itself is a geography lesson, from the Gaelic for headland, a point of land pushing out into water. The clan Ross took their identity from the narrow strip of northern Highland territory between two great firths, and they held it across centuries of shifting loyalties and changing crowns. What makes the Ross story distinct from the clans above it on this list is the second chapter. The battlefield record stretches from Bannockburn through the Jacobite era, which is notable on its own. But the clearances hit Rossshire hard. Tenant families evicted at scale, land converted to sheep pasture, and thousands of people shipped to Canada, Australia, and the United States with almost nothing to carry, except the name. So when you ask what the Ross bloodline fought for, the answer spans centuries. First, territory, then survival on their own land, then survival off it entirely. The next section is where the record gets strange. Number 6. MacGregor. Names get suppressed, records get lost, families get scattered. Those things happen in war, and they're bad enough. But what happened to the MacGregors is something different, and it matters to anyone trying to trace a Scottish bloodline today. Because the state didn't just punish this clan, it tried to delete them by making it a crime to be one. In 1603, following a brutal confrontation at Glenfruin, where MacGregor fighters killed a large number of men from the Colquhoun clan, King James VI passed legislation that went far beyond standard punishment. The MacGregor name itself was outlawed. Families who carried it were forced to adopt other surnames or face execution. They took on Campbell, Murray, Drummond, Grant, whatever offered cover. The ban held for close to 170 years, lifted only in 1774. Now think about what that does to a genealogical record. If your ancestor spent a century and a half living under a borrowed name, the paper trail you're reading today is not their story. It's the alias their survival required. When genealogy researchers hit a wall around certain Scottish family lines in the 17th and 18th centuries, the MacGregor ban is often sitting quietly behind that wall, unmentioned. The clan's identity didn't vanish. It went underground, passed through oral tradition, kept alive in communities that remembered what the written record wasn't allowed to say. That kind of survival doesn't show up in an archive. It shows up in a name that endured anyway, 170 years after someone decided it shouldn't. Once you understand that a name can be legally erased, you start noticing something else. A lot of what we call Scottish surnames arrived from somewhere else entirely. Number 5. Fraser. The Fraser name has nothing Gaelic in its origin. It came from Normandy, possibly linked to the French word for strawberry, which is why the Fraser coat of arms carries strawberry flowers. A Norman family arrived in Scotland in the 12th century, received land grants from the Scottish crown, and within a few generations had become so embedded in Highland culture that most people today assume the name was always there. That's not a small shift. That's an identity adopted so completely that the adopted culture became the one worth dying for. Simon Fraser, the 11th Lord Lovat, was 80 years old when he was beheaded on Tower Hill in London in 1747, executed for his role in the Jacobite Rising. The Fraser clan's territory around Inverness was systematically targeted by British forces after Culloden. Not just defeated, targeted, burned, cleared, punished with deliberate thoroughness. A family with Norman roots, speaking French before it spoke Gaelic, died for a Highland cause on a London scaffold. The blood and soil version of Scottish identity doesn't survive contact with that fact. Loyalty, it turns out, isn't inherited. It's chosen, and the Frasers chose clearly at enormous cost. Now hold that thought, because the next name sits right on the seam between verifiable history and something older and stranger that people can't stop arguing about. Number 4. Sinclair. The Sinclairs arrived from St. Clair-sur-Epte in Normandy, another 12th century import, and built a power base in the far north of Scotland, the Earldom of Caithness, a wind-stripped peninsula that sits geographically apart from the main Highland clan system in ways that still show on a map. But the reason people keep returning to the Sinclair name isn't the military record or the Northern Territory, it's a building. Rosslyn Chapel, completed in 1486, is one of the most densely carved stone interiors in Scotland. The detail is extraordinary, and some of it is hard to explain. Certain carvings appear to depict plants that weren't known in Europe at the time of construction. Whether that's evidence of something or an elaborate misreading, the debate hasn't closed. What is documented, confirmed in 1736, is that the Sinclairs held the hereditary title of Grand Master of Scottish Freemasonry. Some clans carry a war record. The Sinclairs carry a symbol record that still pulls people in. Number 3. Murray. Most people who know Scottish history know William Wallace. Fewer know the man who stood beside him at Stirling Bridge in 1297 and co-commanded the most decisive Scottish victory of the Wars of Independence. Andrew de Moray led the Northern Uprising that made Stirling possible. He died of wounds shortly after the battle and was largely written out of the story that followed. Wallace became the legend. Murray became a footnote. But the clan didn't disappear into that footnote. The Murrays spread across Scotland over the following centuries, carrying a name rooted in Moray, one of the oldest inhabited territories in the British Isles, a place with a history that predates the Scottish kingdom itself. That's the thing about the Murray name. It's older than the nation it helped build, and the man who arguably saved that nation at its most desperate moment didn't survive long enough to be remembered properly. Number 2. Stewart. The name starts quietly. A steward, a household manager, someone responsible for keeping a great estate running. Then one of them married into the royal line, and in 1371 Robert Stewart became Robert II, the first Stuart King of Scotland. What followed was a dynasty that produced Mary Queen of Scots, shaped British political history for 4 centuries, and ended, repeatedly and violently, in exile. Every Jacobite rising from 1689 through 1745 was fought to put a Stuart back on a throne they'd been removed from by parliamentary force. These weren't romantic rebellions. They were restoration campaigns with real military objectives and catastrophic consequences for the people who backed them. After Culloden, Highland dress was banned. The tartan ban was designed specifically to destroy the visible markers of clan identity, to make loyalty to the Stuart cause socially and legally impossible to express. The Stuart name outlasted the dynasty, outlasted the ban, and carries every one of those risings inside it. Number 1. MacKinnon. The MacKinnons of Skye are one of the oldest clans in the Inner Hebrides. Their seat predates written Scottish history. But what defines the MacKinnon name in the historical record is a single documented decision made after Culloden, when Bonnie Prince Charlie was a fugitive being hunted across the Highlands with a price on his head large enough to buy a village. John MacKinnon, the clan chief, personally rode the prince to the mainland from Skye. Not a slogan, not a symbolic gesture, a physical act with known consequences. MacKinnon was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Released eventually because of his age. The clan's lands were forfeited. Their numbers fell. The name survived primarily in diaspora communities in Canada and the United States, carried there by families who left with almost nothing. That's what fought for looks like when the history is being honest with you. These 12 names aren't labels. They're evidence. Each one records a loyalty, a territory, a decision made under pressure that someone passed down to you without telling you what it cost. The official story converts all of that into heritage tourism. Tartan and shortbread and misty postcards. The names carry something harder. Drop your surname in the comments. Tell me which side you've been told your people stood on and where they ended up. Subscribe, because the next investigation goes somewhere the textbooks won't. And sit with this question before you go. If a government can make it a criminal offense to carry a name, what else got erased from your family's record before it ever reached you? Because the archive you're reading isn't the full story. It's the version they allowed to survive.